Well, hi everyone. This is Jerry Couchman speaking from my own shop north of Ferndale. And I'm really honored to be part of the virtual program that we're doing tonight. Sanding is not one of our favorite operations, right? So there are lots of machines and hand sanders that work with dust collection to make that process a lot more efficient and enjoyable to a point, and safer because of the dust collection, of course. So tonight, George and I will show you what we use in our shops. Hopefully by now you've gotten the latest newsletter, which should have a handout on, basic sanding operations and some of the concepts involved with sanding. So we're not going to cover that kind of detail. And before I get into my demos tonight, let's look at the sanders that I use in my shop, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. Now, the first machine I want to talk about is probably the most important machine in the shop. It's a Jet 2244 drum sander, and it has the capability to do up to 44 inches because it's open-ended on one side. And I keep sanding materials, sanding paper in stock in this little lower cabinet. This is a roll of 80 grit. And normally I put 150 grit in the machine. It's got a variable speed belt drive and of course dust collection to my central system. And I do just about everything, every project with this machine because I want to take off planer marks and have all of stock material ready for final sanding so that it's a lot easier, a lot more efficient. There'll be a demonstration about that, and I'm gonna show you what I plan to run through the planer. It's actually a pretty large piece. It's a hall table or a sofa table with a slab that has been sanded by the guy that sold it, but he left a lot of bandsaw marks that need to come off, and it's not perfectly flat. So before I do any finishing or final sanding, I want to take all that off. So we'll run that through the drum sander, and to get an even finish on both sides, I'm going to have to flip it 180 degrees. So you'll see that in one of my demos. The next machine is an old belt sander. I think I've had this 25 or 30 years. It's a Makita 9403, and it's got a 4-inch wide platen and belt, which I have 80 grit sandpaper on right now. And what I use that for is primarily for my boxes, smoothing the corners of dovetail keys. And here is one of my small boxes that have the keys trimmed down by to the point where there's just maybe a 32nd of an inch exposure, and of course lots of glue that needs to come off. So this operation cleans that up, and then all I have to do is final sanding on the sides. Another good operation that it's useful for is our small cabinets that have the same kind of joinery system in the corners, just a little bit bigger. So it's basically the same operation. And I've got a video on that as well. I use a DeWalt orbital sander. This one is got 5-inch discs, and I buy boxes of the discs and various grits from 400 up to 120 is the coarsest I've ever used, I guess. And they're hook and loop, and they come on and off really easy. And this is basically what I do most of my final sanding with, down to either 320 or 400. And then some hand sanding on top of that before finishing. But it's got a good dust collection system. It just connects to my shop vac. Of course, the Makita belt sander connects to the shop vac as well. So that's good for my health. Okay, let's go around the shop, and I've got two other machines that I use. So this one is an old combination sander. It's got a belt on one side and a disc on the other. It's made by Grizzly. I think I've had it for almost 30 years. The disc is 12 inches and the belt is 6 inches wide. Runs on 220. It's on my dust collection system, and it has the capability of adjustable tables for both parts of the machine. And sometimes I take the main table off the belt so that I can do hand sanding, or not hand sanding, but sanding by eye to form curved surfaces. And I do that with my pagoda boxes. The lids on my pagoda boxes got kind of a gentle curve to them. So the best way to do that is on this big belt sander. And then I proceed to the orbital sander to do the final. The other machine that I use quite often is this really cheap Grizzly oscillating spindle sander. And it's the cheapest one they've got, but it does the job. And it's got 6 different diameters for the spindles. The one that's on there right now is actually 3 inches in diameter. So those are my machines, and you'll see videos on most of those, or demos on most of those. And so that's it. We'll get to the demos. One of the most important operations to master with this jet drum sander is changing belts. So I'll do that right now. I've got a clip system that releases and secures the belts pretty fast. It's spring-loaded, and then you just feed the new sanding belt on and not have any gaps or any overlap. I'm actually changing from 150 to 80 grit right now. And that's it. I've made several passes with the coarse grit, so now I'm using the 150 grit to do the final smoothing. Well, it needs a few more passes, but you get the general idea. I'm going to demonstrate how I use my belt sander with 80 grit sanding paper on it to smooth the dovetails that I put, the dovetail splines I put into boxes. This happens to be a small shadow box with 3/4 inch dovetails, and you'll see that it's the box itself is in cherry. The dovetails have been sawed off with a bandsaw so that there's not very much material left to take off. You can see it's rough, and you can see the glue stains around the edges. So we're going to take care of all that with just a few seconds on each corner to remove the material and make it nice and smooth. So I don't keep it on the wood very long because it can burn. And I keep looking at it frequently so I can see how far I've gone and then stop when it's absolutely ready. So here goes. I keep a little bit of forward pressure on the front of the handle on the belt sander. And that prevents me from digging in the tail and causing a divot on the back of the sander. And that's it. It's nice and smooth. This material didn't burn. The dovetails are actually made out of walnut, a Peruvian walnut to be exact. So I just I use a vise like this, I move it around to the next corner, set it up, and I'm ready to go again. Another application for my old Makita belt sander is to smooth the drawer sides that have dovetails. And I do a little bit of trimming on the table saw to remove any excess that's sticking out beyond the sides of the drawer. And then I just use the belt sander the same as I did on the small boxes, and take off the excess pins that are sticking out beyond the tails so that they're nice and flush, and all the glue that may be in that area. So let's watch that. That's it. It's nice and smooth, and all I have to do is final sand. I mentioned earlier that I use my Grizzly combination belt sander, disc sander to smooth the pagoda tops for my pagoda boxes. This oscillating spindle sander can also be used to smooth the top surfaces, which are concave. And before I do that, I have to remove most of the material with a bandsaw. So the next step is to use this jig, which is used on both the bandsaw and this spindle sander, to remove the bandsaw marks. So it takes a little bit longer to get all the bandsaw marks out, but it ends up with a fairly smooth surface. And then to do each section, I just unscrew this, rotate it 90 degrees, and then do the next section. This doesn't leave a perfect curve, a fair curve, so I end up doing a little bit of hand sanding with a curved platen to take out any ripples that might be there from the oscillating spindle sander, but it turns out pretty nice. I need to add some comments about the overall process for shaping my pagoda box lids. The jig you see here for cutting the top curves is set at 15 degrees, and I use that both on the bandsaw and the oscillating spindle sander. The curves on this blank are drawn in with pencil using two templates. One's 7 inches of radius and the other is 4.5 inches radius for the ends. And then the hand sanding that I do to remove the oscillating spindle sander ripples are just wooden platens, and I use 150 grit and 240 grit. And then I follow it up with my orbital sander with 320 grit to smooth out the scratches and to make the curves perfectly fair curves. So the final demonstration you'll see on my Grizzly belt sander is used for the bottom of the pagoda box lids, and this is the template that I use to draw in the lines, which forms the border where I don't want to sand, so it leaves the top flat to rest on the box. So you'll see that next. So after I get the basic shape of the bottom of the pagoda box done on the belt sander, I have to follow that up with some orbital sanding with 220 grit, because the coarse grit on that belt sander leaves lots of scratches and it's not perfectly rounded. So I'll work on that right now and then we'll be done. So of course I'll go all the way around the box lid and do the same thing, but it also gets a little final sanding with 320 grit, and then it's ready for the next stage and it'll become part of a nice pagoda box.
Hi everyone. We're here talking about sanding tonight. I'm going to share with you the process that I have settled in on for probably 80% of what I do these days, and that ranges anywhere from small desktop projects to pretty complex furniture projects. Sanding is one of those topics where there really is not one size that fits all for everyone. It's kind of like finishing that way. But what I'm going to share is, again, like I said, what I use for most of my work, and then after that, I will maybe address a few of the unique situations and how I deal with those, and a couple tips and tricks on and things on some of the materials and tools and supplies that I prefer for what that's worth. So let's talk about the basic start. I process my lumber to start with, flattening with the joiner, thicknessing and surfacing with the planer. And I will, at the planer, take my material usually to the point where I leave an extra about a 32nd of an inch. Then I go to a dual drum sander with 150 grit, and with a 32nd of an inch to take off, I will be able to take 2 or 3 passes on each side, and that will take away any tool marks left by the joiner and planer, and straighten the grain scratches out and dial in my thickness to where I want it to be, as precise as I want it to be. At that point is where I'm going to start here now. So I'm using, for the lion's share of my work, the next step for me is going to be a random orbital sander, and I went with 150 grit on the drum sander, and I'm going to start with 150 grit on the random orbital sander. And there are several things you need to kind of keep in mind with random orbital sanders. You want to overlap your passes by, I do by 50%. Some people do only by a third. At 50%, when I move over from the first pass, move over half the diameter of the disc, that essentially sands everything twice. The first pass gets it one time, and then when you shift over halfway, that's half of that gets another sanding. So that's key. Second thing that's really important is how fast you move or how slow you move. You have to keep in mind with a random orbital sander, there's actually rotation happening in 2 different levels. There is a small orbit that's happening, and then the disc, and that's just in place. Okay. Then the disc also rotates. Okay. So if I'm moving the sander like this, the small orbit is happening, but the big is going like crazy. it ends up leaving corkscrew scratches or pigtail scratches. As opposed to if I move it slowly and methodically, the small circles are slowly rotating and re-sanding, so you actually get more sanding efficiency by going slower. So the pace that I go is 1 inch per second. So to put that in perspective, hopefully you can see this on the screen here. I've made marks here every inch. So there's 10 inches here. So if I was to start at the first one, at 1 inch per second, that's going to move 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, 1,005. And I'm not sure if this is how slow you go or not, but that's where I go. And again, that allows those small rotations to continue around and sand each other off. So especially in the very first grit that you use, which is more the material removal phase and the shaping and flattening, after that first grit, the next paper is just going to be taking away the scratches from the previous grit. You're not shaping with that. So in the first pass with the first grit, it's really important to be going slow like that to get a good flat, even, smooth surface. So that's important. The other thing that I'll do, and that applies on all pieces, all sizes. What I'll do in addition, if I have a large surface area, let's say it's a dining room table top or a desk top, this piece is only 2 feet by 3 feet, but this is in that same sort of range. If you have a softwood, especially something like Douglas fir or pine, you have a real drastic difference between the spring wood and the summer wood. The spring growth is very fast and the wood is very soft. Summertime comes around and heat and humidity change and the growth slows down and the wood is harder. So as you're sanding, if you're always going with the grain, there's a tendency to get kind of a washboard effect because the sandpaper is more aggressive at removing the softwood than it is the hardwood. So in order to try and offset that or to reduce that, I will go diagonally across the grain, like that, all the way across the whole board. Then when I change to the next grit, I rotate 90 degrees and I'll go this way. I'll go 90 degrees to the grain or to the first pass, right? So I'm not following the soft and hard growth patterns dipping into it. I'm diagonally cutting across it so I span across and I have less of a tendency to create that hills and valleys kind of a scenario. So I'll work my way up as I go. Every time I change grit, I change the direction. The last grit, and there's another benefit actually to doing it that way, because when I make passes like this, I can actually see in the scratches, I can tell that that's the direction the sander was moving. So when I change in the next grit, I see that the scratches changed direction. So I can easily see where I have been and where I haven't been. If I get interrupted partway through the project and I stop and I come back and say, where did I leave off? It's easy to find it when you've got scratches that go 90 degrees to each other. You can easily spot that. So that helps you out in that scenario. And again, the last pass, I'll go with the grain then. And I generally stop at 220 for most finishes that I use and the kinds of woods that I use. The added benefit of going up in higher grits is so minimal that I don't go there. So at that stage, I'm switching over then to a block sander, and I just want to straighten out any minute little swirls that might be left in here from the random orbital sander, I want to straighten out and have go with the grain. So I'll use a hand sander block and go end to end on the whole thing. And I go the same grip. So if I stopped at 220 with the random orbital, I go 220 on the block sander at this point. So I just need to be doing one complete pass all the way across uniformly. It'll help you a lot if you, well, let's put it here. If you sand in one place for a while and you don't ever lift up on the sander, the sawdust that's created from the first few passes stays underneath the block, and it becomes a layer of marbles, and it keeps the grit suspended above the solid wood. So you're really not sanding, you're just sliding the sawdust. You need to get that stuff out of there. And the way that I find works best for me is to do touch and go landings with my airplane. So I'm gonna drop down in and then lift out. And what ends up happening is you'll see, actually, if you had some bright light in your shop, you'll see as you lift out, there's a swirl of the dust that gets released. And as you come back and you lift up, a swirl of dust comes out there. That clears more of the dust away, so your grit is actually in contact with the wood and you're more efficiently sanding. So try to do that, and it also helps reduce. There's a tendency a lot of times with us, if we're staying in contact, the block does this kind of thing. So pretty soon you got a round over there, and maybe you didn't want a round over. You're going to do something else for an edge treatment. So that one might save you some grief down the line if you're going that direction. And I'll go down to the other one, down that later. Another thing that you want to be concerned about in terms of, at this stage we've gotten the surface flat. What about the ends and the edges? The edges you're going to sand the same way, go through that same process. The end grain, if it's going to be exposed, I always, if you stop at the same point, if you go to 220 grit on the end grain, regardless of whether you put a stain on or a clear finish, what ends up happening is that the open pores of the end grain on the end of that are like straws. They absorb more material and the wood gets darker than the long grain face of your piece. So you need to go higher in the grit, finer with the sandpaper, on the end grain, which the ultimate effect is that it burnishes, and which closes off those pores enough to where they don't absorb as much material as the face grain does. So you end up with the colors being much, much closer, as opposed to the end grain being considerably darker. And if you stain or dye the wood, it's more pronounced. But even with clear finishes, the end grain will be considerably darker than the face grain if you stop at the same grit. So I generally go up 2 grits beyond the stopping point on the face grain anytime I have end grain, and that would be in instances like something like this, where the end grain up here on the top of the leg, it's rounded, it flows, but if that end grain is not sanded to a finer grit, it's going to jump out as a big dark splotch. Same thing on the ends of this board. This is end grain on here. So it occurs a lot. I mean, there are a lot of pieces of furniture where you're going to find that sort of situation as a potential. So at that stage, now you're up to the final grit level. Now I want to clear it off and check it. Okay, I've been brushing off. Usually, I'll use a bench brush to clean. Anytime I change grit, I want to make sure that if any of the grit fell off the paper, before I go to a smaller grit, I want to make sure all those large pieces of grit are cleared off there. Otherwise, that large piece of grit gets rolling around underneath my, that 150 grit is laying underneath my 220, and it's going to scratch it. So try and clear it off between sanding, between grits, with a brush at least. When you've gotten the last grit, I'll use a shop vac with, it's just a standard upholstery brush, but that brush has enough bristle that that'll raise up and pull out any of the sawdust that's left behind by the sander, And again, I'll always go with the grain. Some bristles on some of these guys are a little more coarse than others, and if it is coarse, and I'm going to put any kind of scratch at all, I want it to be with the grain, so it's the least noticeable. So, okay, we vacuumed the whole thing, and again, I'll prefer this. You can also blow it off with the compressor. I prefer this method. It's just a lot cleaner. The air compressor scatters the dust. It sends it everywhere. Fine finger dust mask, you know, the air filter above, that's all good. My preference is just, this is a lot cleaner, and I think it's actually more efficient. Anytime I'm blowing dust with an air compressor, some of it swirls around up in the air and then eventually just comes right back down again. So I haven't really eliminated it, I've just moved it around. So this I believe does a much better job. And I still follow that up with a wiping rag. And these are microfiber rags. I mean, you can buy them at the Woodcraft and Rockler stores and Highland Hardware and all those places. I actually found these Harbor Freight. With a coupon, they're like 99 cents for a bag of 4 of them. These do a really good job at attracting the dust and clearing them off. And after you use them, toss them in the laundry with your dirty clothes, and they're good to go and clean for the next project you have. So at that point now we've got everything, we think, clean and scratch free. But the way to find out before you put finish on, which is where it really pops out, the best way to spot any of that stuff is to get a good bright light and get it down at a low angle and get your eyes down at a low angle. And what you're looking for here is going to be a scratch across your field of view. Because what will happen, any scratch that goes across this way with your light behind there, it's going to show up as a shadow line. When I get down here, I can see any scratch that goes across there. But if the scratch goes from the light towards me, the light is bouncing off of both sides of that scratch, so I really don't notice that one. So you have to turn the piece 90 degrees and check it that way too, because then you will notice that scratch that goes with the grain. You won't see the other one, because now you're looking down that valley. So be sure to either rotate your workpiece 90 degrees and check it both ways, or move the light 90 degrees and check both ways. This is the 300 watt bulb, and this does a good job. I actually prefer, if it's a sunny day, it's even better light if I can move a little table or a bench out by the garage door and open up the door and use natural light, because that'll oftentimes pick up even more than a bright light here. So that's kind of your choice on that, but that will show any other scratches that were left behind, and I will generally back up 1 grit and lightly work that area where any scratches appeared, and then go back up to the final grit, and then do the same thing again. The vacuum, wipe it down, put the light on, and check it for that. Okay, and that's what I do for, like I said, 80%, maybe even 90% of my work. That procedure does it. I do 150 grit on my drum sander, and I do 150 and 220 on my random orbital sander, 220 on a block sander. Occasionally I'll use 180 in between the two, but with this sandpaper that I get from Klingspor, I was going to throw that in at the end. Anyway, I feel real good with being able to go from 150 to 220, and the 220 is sharp enough and sturdy enough. It cleans up very nicely from after the 150. Some people are religious about not skipping any grits in between, and if that's what works for you, that's what works for you. Go for it. Again, that's the lion's share. Let's maybe talk about a few other kinds of things that I run into. This is something I use off and on. What I've got is a plate glass shelf from a bookshelf. It's 3/8 of an inch thick, and I have some PSA sandpaper that I put on there. This happened to be a roll of 10-inch wide stuff that I found, and I can't find any more. But that works great for this. You can also buy 4.5-inch wide rolls of PSA backed sandpaper, and put 2 strips, 3 strips, whatever you need for the size of glass you've got. But I'll use this oftentimes if I'm gluing up small box kinds of things, and by some weird chance, if that joint isn't flush, and I've got a lid that's going to sit on it, I've got to get that surface all in one plane. Plate glass is good and dead flat. Get the sandpaper on there. I can sit that piece on and work that evenly and slowly. Use pressure points on all 4 corners to make sure you're sanding it evenly. But I can get that dialed in to where that's all perfectly flat and smooth in the same plane. And you can do the same thing if there's a joint just a whisker off there. This is far less aggressive than an edge sander, for example, which does the same job but with power, and it's going faster and it's more prone to having a little drag to it. This is very subdued and controllable very easily. So I've also actually, if you end up with do a glue up on, say, a table or a chair, and it's got a little teeter to it, the one leg needs to be shortened a little bit so it sits down flat. Stick the PSA paper on a strip of it or something on your table saw top, put the leg that's long on there, and just slide the chair back and forth and move it off the paper and check it. It's sort of doing the same sort of thing as this is, but you're just working one leg instead of all 4 surfaces. Let's see, let's talk a little bit about a live edge slab kind of thing. I've seen a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, I've seen quite a few live edge slabs where people have gone with a random orbital sander to clean up the edges. And if what you're going for with a live edge slab is to have a natural organic looking edge, you really don't want flat surfaces on there. I mean, this has got some nice cool configurations there that you want to try and keep there, but just smooth them out. Clean them up and smooth them out. Get the dirt and the cambium layer, that papery layer underneath the bark, get that cleaned out, but not change the shape. So what do you use for that? For quite a while, I've used, it's called a mop sander. So you can either, and it's just strips of sandpaper, you can see that alternate back and forth. Comes in all different grits. You can either chuck it into a drill press like this, or sorry, into a drill like this, or you put that into a drill press and you take the piece to the drill press this way, or if it's too big to lift up and put it in the drill press, you put it on the drill and you just take the drill and work around it. So this does a pretty good job. I find that it's not as aggressive, not that aggressive. You got to work on it quite a while. And then I talked to some guys that had found this tool, and it's called a wheel brush. Looks like a belt sander, but it's got coarse nylon bristles on a drum. Those come in different grits also. But this guy makes very quick business of removing the grit and stuff that looks like that. And you look at the shape of all that. See how much of that got left there? None of it is flattened out. None of it wasn't scraped off. You've got all the nooks and crannies just nicely cleaned out and smooth. Still have all the natural features there. That's been a great one. Again, that's a unique situation. Not everybody does live edge slab stuff, and how much you do of it will either justify another tool or not, depending on where you are with all that. Okay. Let's see. How about another one on shaping stuff? These guys are real handy. Emery boards, find them in any manicure section at a drugstore. or you can make your own, just a piece of thin plywood and PSA paper on it. This allows you to get into nooks and crannies and corners and things like where if you used a round over bit and put a radius on this inside edge, when you got to the corner, the bearing that's guiding, that's following it, the bearings going to make it leave a round corner in there. If you want that radius to look the best it can look, you can use this guy and get into that corner and extend the round over all the way to the actual corner and eliminate that bearing shape that's in the corner there. A lot of other things like that where you're just kind of doing the final cleanup that a tool couldn't do because it had a bearing or something in it. Other things for shaping. These are called tadpoles. You wrap sandpaper around them. You got a 90-degree corner there for getting in to tight spaces. There's one that's a little steeper angle. Outside radius and rounded ones. I think I use the round ones more often than not for sanding coves. They'll come in a set where you get like 8 or 10 different radiuses of round. And another set you get 8 or 10 different radiuses of this shape. And there are tons of them out there. They are extremely useful for that final cleanup sanding. For those of you who have drum sanders, and I know there are a lot of people in the club that do have them. If you don't have one of these crepe erasers to clean your sandpaper on the drum, you have to get them. I mean, they're just the only thing it really extends the life of the belt. Sometimes, eventually it's going to happen to you if it hasn't already, that you're going to have a board that has some pitch in it, or some resin in there, or maybe some excess glue on a glued up joint that gets on that belt, and it'll be a stripe that's on there that's usually right in the middle. You know, you got this nice wide drum sander so you can do wide boards, and then you get that pitch right in the middle. Well, now I can only do something that's 9 inches wide on this side or on that side, or else I chuck that paper and have to put a new one on. This eraser, if you use it frequently enough, it'll prevent that from happening or reduce the chances of it happening. If you get that happening and it ends up looking something like that, I have found some stuff from a place in Tacoma called Superior Saw. This product is called Reuse It. It's made down in Arizona. I use this to clean pitch off of my saw blades, my router bits. It emulsifies the pitch. So it basically just dissolves it. And then you just rinse it off with water. So on my drum sander, I use from Klingspor their polyester backed sandpaper in a roll, cut it to length, cut the taper on the end. The polyester backing is waterproof. There are some papers for drum sanders that is cloth backed, some that is paper backed, and those are not waterproof. The big plus for me, having a water resistance backing, is I can use this Reuse It. You mix it 50-50 with water. I'll put it in a spray bottle, spray it on and this could work for a belt sander, for a drum sander, for an edge sander, anything with it that you get pitch on. So I took this strip of drum sander paper, sprayed it with that spray, and 2 minutes later rinsed it off with water, and I've got a brand new belt back. Quite a difference. So I'll just lay this out in the driveway, spray it with that stuff, and then rinse it off with a hose, and you're good to go. With saw blades and router bits, I keep a quart of this, pre-mixed in a tomato sauce jar. Pour it into a bowl, put the blade in, dissolve it, and pour it back into the jar. And I just keep reusing that same batch. I finally mixed a second jar of it after using the other one for like 6 or 7 years. It still is just as effective. So good stuff. if you want to try and find some of this, get a hold of me and I can steer you there. I haven't found anybody up here in the Bellingham, Mount Vernon area that sells it. I've got a pretty good sized jug. I can probably set you up with something. Sanding blocks. They're called a prepping weapon. Rockler Woodcraft, all the woodworking stores sell them. I think I've seen them actually in a couple paint shops. I really like them. There's a real nice ergonomic, comfortable finger hold pulls on them. It's a good weight. There's a good firm rubber backing to them that does a really good job.